Hey there, Emmanuel here from WebDevFuel, and in this video I'm going to take a break from working on the HTMX and GoSASS blueprint, which by the way, if you want to join, I'm going to leave a link in the description down below, to explain something related to Go, which I saw in a recent conversation on X. And that is a common thing that Go is criticized for, which is initializing maps and also slices as nil by default. So as you can see, we have here three different variables. This one is a map, which we'll call map1, and the keys are going to be strings, and the values any. And then we want to print if the map1 is nil, and then we pass here map1 equals nil. And we also want to print the address by saying here percentage sign and then the letter P. And by doing this, we are going to print here if this is nil or not, so either true or false, and then the address that points to this map. Now, one thing that a lot of people might not be aware of is that Golang by default, all the maps and also all of the slices are references and not values. What this means is that instead of a map or a slice holding the value itself, it holds a pointer in memory to the value itself or a reference. And even though we don't have the asterisk here before the map keyword, which would make it a pointer, underneath the hood, it still behaves more or less as a pointer to a type. If we take a look at the slice, we initialize here a slice of type any, and we do the exact same thing. We want to say and print here if this is nil or not, and we also want to print the address. And finally, we have here a struct. So we have this data struct, which has an ID and a value. Both of these are strings. And if we initialize this in the following way by only declaring the variable, then we also get this initialized by default as nil. In this case, we want to specify that this is a pointer to this type, but underneath the hood, all of these three different variables are going to be initialized in the exact same way. By default, they are going to be initialized as nil. The reason for this, and why I think that this makes sense in the Go language, is because if we think of maps underneath the hood, they are sort of quote-unquote referential values. They do not hold the value itself, but rather a pointer in memory to the value. Same thing with the map, same thing with the slices, and then once we have a type that we want it to be a pointer, we add again the asterisk before the type itself, and it also becomes a referential value. So it references that value in memory instead of holding the value itself. So if we now navigate here to a different tab and we run the program, as you'll be able to see, map1 is nil, the slice 1 is nil, and the data 1 is also nil. And here we have these addresses, which is the default one. So this is nil, so we don't have any address that this is pointing to currently. And the reason for me saying that this makes sense in Golang is because if we start using Golang, we are new to programming or even to the Go language itself only, we might think that this is a bit confusing because if we initialize a slice of something, we might assume that by default it should initialize it with no items, and it actually initializes the slice itself instead of being nil. If we declare the map, we could also think that by default it should do that for us, but the reality is in Golang, if we only declare a variable which is a reference and not a value, it initializes as nil, that is quote-unquote the zero value. If we have other types which are not references or pointers, then it is going to have a zero value. For example, for number, that is the number 0. For a string, it is an empty string. For boolean, it is false, and so on and so on. But in Golang, each time we have a reference, it is nil by default. Same thing also with channels, which we won't get into in this video, but it is the exact same concept. And I think that if Go would make sort of this distinction between maps and slices and a quote-unquote normal pointer to a type, which has some differences, but under the hood they work more or less the same. then I think it would even be more confusing. When I started working with Go and when I started learning the language, it is true that it was a bit confusing for me because I did not understand this concept in Go. So each time that we initialize something that is a reference, it is nil. And if we had, for example, the behavior here being this would be initialized as nil, but this wouldn't, then I think it would be more confusing at this point for me using Go, because I know that this is always a reference. In my mind, I know that I initialize this and I have a quote unquote pointer to something. Same thing with the slices, and same thing when I explicitly define this here as a pointer to this type. So this is the reason that I think Go should not change this at all, and instead leave things alone and leave things as they are, because for beginners it is confusing, not because Go is doing something wrong, but rather because it is how Go works, and it would be even more confusing to have some things be initialized as nil when we declare a variable, other things not being initialized as nil. I think it is best to be as explicit as possible, which is one of the things that Go truly shines, which is we want to always be as specific as possible, as explicit as possible in our code. So if we wanted to initialize these things or declare them and be able to not have them be nil by default, we have ways of doing that. So if we want to not have to declare this and then assign it, for example, to a map which is not nil or to a slice which is not nil, we don't have to take two different steps. We can do also the exact same thing in one line. And that would be for the map to use the make keyword and pass the type of the map here. And the type that we would be having here inside of this variable would be the exact same one that we had up here. So if we uncomment this again, and we take a look at this type, it is the exact same one. And then if we also take a look here at the slice, to initialize it without being or to instantiate it without it being nil, we simply need to use here colon equals and then pass here the type, which is a slice of any, and then initialize it here with the curly braces. This means that we initialize the slice with 0 items inside of the slice. And finally, to initialize here the data or a pointer to this struct data, we do the following things. We need to pass here this ampersand, then we say here data, and then we also pass here the curly braces. As a result, we have here a pointer to data, and here we have the exact same thing. But if we only declare the variable, by default, it is going to be nil. And one thing to also keep in mind is that if we try to do something like this, we cannot compare, for example, only this data struct to nil, because again, one thing that is very crucial to always remember is that everything that is a reference, whether that is a pointer, whether that is a slice or a map, maps and slices are their own thing. They behave in a bit different way than pointers. We cannot, for example, dereference them, but underneath the hood, they are the exact same thing. So we have addresses pointing to something instead of holding the value itself. So now if we were to print this exact same thing, here, as you'll be able to see, we have here the map 1, the slice 1, and the data 1 as true. And then we have the map 2 is not nil, so nil is false. We have here the address. We have here the slice 2, which is also not nil, and we have here the address, and the same thing for the data 2. Also, one cool thing about maps and slices is that we can either initialize them in the following way by using the curly braces after specifying the type, or we can always use the make keyword. If we take a look here at the documentation, the make built-in function allocates and initializes an object of type slice, map, or also a channel, which again, we're not going to cover in this video. So if I were to delete this thing and add here the curly braces, and I were to delete here the curly braces and replace it with the make keyword, and then I would say here 0. In the case of the slice, we need to specify the size that we want to initialize it as, And then we can take a look here again at the console, and if we run this, again all of these three are going to be nil by default, and then we have these ones which are false, and we have here their addresses printed. With this being said, I hope this video helped you understand why Go doesn't initialize maps and slices for us by default, and why we need to explicitly initialize them ourselves. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.